Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in our season of live podcasts recorded at the Regent Street Cinema in London, it's another film of ideas. I'm going to be talking to the writer and philosopher Lea Ypi about the film of the life of the revolutionary Rosa Luxemburg. It is, in some ways, although only in a few ways, a conventional biopic, but this is also a film about philosophy, about revolution, and also about the impossibly blurred line, particularly in the life of a revolutionary, between the personal and the political. Once again, I'm very conscious that the conversation that you're going to hear is in front of an audience, all of whom have just watched the film, Rosa Luxemburg, and you listening probably, I might say almost certainly, it's Christmas Eve, haven't just watched it. So I want to say a little bit about the film that we are discussing. It came out in 1986. It's a West German film. It was directed by the feminist filmmaker Margaretha von Trotta. It stars Barbara Sukowa, a German actor who won the Cannes Best Actress Award, as it used to be called back then, in 1986. As I suggested, it is a biopic. It's the story of a life. It does not tell that life exactly chronologically. It starts in the middle, in 1906, and it goes backwards as well as forwards, backwards to the origin of Rosa Luxemburg's revolutionary activities and also to her childhood, her upbringing in Poland. She was Polish, not German. And she came from a pretty bourgeois background. And one of the themes of the film is her lingering attachment to the bourgeois world. Rosa Luxemburg wanted some of the trappings of a bourgeois life, a husband, children, a family, a home, at the same time as all her life being devoted to the overthrow of the form of economics and politics that made bourgeois life possible. She wanted to emancipate the world from the things she grew up in without ever quite losing her attachment to it. But the film mainly projects forward, and particularly to its central theme, which is Rosa Luxemburg's opposition to the First World War, not just to German participation in the war, but to the war itself, the whole idea of militarism, of imperialism. Many of the scenes in the film, and it is pretty accurately based on her life, are set in prison. She was jailed by the German wartime state, never convicted, but jailed simply as a threat, ostensibly for her own safety, actually for the safety of the regime, for much of the war. So many of the scenes are in prison. When the war ended, when the military machine collapsed, and Germany had a kind of revolution and became at least a putative social democratic state, Luxemburg was released, but she once again found herself an outsider. It was not her revolution, and it was not her version of social democracy. And the film ends as Luxemburg's life ended, not long after the climax of the First World War, in January 1919, with her murder. She was effectively assassinated by what may or may not have been a renegade paramilitary group, probably acting with the connivance of the socialist regime in Berlin. So it's a film that ends with murder and death. It is a kind of tragedy, but it is also a film about Luxemburg's personal relationships, her love life, her lover, one of them who gets quite a big part in the film, a man called Lea Ypi. And it's about her relationship with other Marxist leaders, with philosophers, and with ideas. So it is a very serious film of ideas. It's a pretty serious film, as well as being a seriously great film. Lea Ypi, with whom I'm discussing the movie, is well known to PPF listeners. She's been a regular with us. She's a writer. She's a philosopher. She grew up in communist Albania, behind the Iron Curtain, deep behind the Iron Curtain. And that childhood, that upbringing, was the subject of her best-selling and prize-winning memoir, Free, the story of her young life. She is a professional philosopher and political theorist. She's a professor at the London School of Economics, and she's written extensively about Marxism, about socialist ideas, and about Rosa Luxemburg herself. But she is also well known as a memoirist, not just for her autobiographical account of her own childhood. Her most recent book, called Indignity, tells the story of her grandmother's life. So this is a conversation with Lea about philosophy, about ideas, about Marxism, as you'll hear, but it's also about what is the subject of this film, the relationship between philosophy, biography, and revolution. So Lea, there's lots to talk about in relation to that film, the life and the ideas. I want to start with the structure, the chronology of it, because we begin in the middle of the war with Rosa Luxemburg incarcerated, and then we go back in two stages. First of all, to 1906, to Warsaw, where she's also incarcerated in the terrible mock execution scene. And then we go back from there to 1899, and what feels like a pivotal scene in the film, and maybe the starting point of the story as it's told here, which is that fantastic New Year's Eve ball where the party get together and let their hair down and put on red noses, at which she refuses to dance with Bernstein, and she does dance with Babel. How do you read the significance of that scene as a starting point for this story?
Actually, I would say both scenes are really important. So the first one that starts with her in Poland as part of the Polish social democratic movement. We gather that her identity as a Polish social democrat is very important. And what's also very important to that context, and was important throughout Luxemburg's life, is Russia and the Russian Empire, which of course Poland at that point is part of. And it's important because 1905 is of course the year of the first Russian Revolution, what is often called the dress rehearsal for the 1917 revolution. And the experience of that revolution was really important, not just to Luxemburg herself, to the Polish social democratic movement. Not only did it change the way in which the Bolsheviks thought about revolution, about the state, about liberalism, but also shaped the fate of the left in the years to come. So I think that moment in Poland is really important, and that engagement of Luxemburg with that part of socialist history is really important. And then we have the further back, the scene from the New Year's Eve 1900, where we see this character that emerges, Bernstein, whom Luxemburg dismisses. And if you recall the scene from the movie, she says, "I can't argue with you by day and dance with you in the evening." And that indicates the real core of Luxemburg's disagreement with, this time, the German Social Democrats. And in particular, with Bernstein, who was the most important theoretical figure of German social democracy, and indeed someone that is more or less responsible for German social democracy and then later social democracy more generally, choosing the path of reform versus revolution.
And yet it feels to me, so if I had to say what I think is going on in that scene, so it's clear where her dividing line is then. It's against opportunism, as she calls it, reformism, evolutionary, socialism, parliamentarianism, all the things that she's against. But she is among friends. Her friends are Babel, with whom she dances, the two Kautskys. This is still, she feels in a way, her party, and it's a very optimistic scene, and it's a very touching scene. It looks like this was the most fun time to be a revolutionary. All of these people are going to let her down. All of these people, in a way, are going to betray her, and that's because of another key scene, which is that dinner party, the one with Clara Zetkin, the one at which, if you remember in the film, she makes a joke and she says the last two men of German social democracy. But Babel mansplains courage to her. And he says to her, "You're very courageous, Rosa. That's great, lovely, Rosa, red Rosa. But let me tell you, courage is something that you have to use. It's a tool and you have to know when to use it." And she says, "Yes, and your test will come, people like you." And it comes in 1914 and they fail it.
Yeah, I think it's really important also to remember that the reason in the beginning, in the first scene, so 1900, she's amongst friends, it's because Bernstein was a minority figure in his position at that point. So the mainstream position in social democracy was that democracy and capitalism are not compatible, and therefore to democratize first of all, to demand the transition from a monarchic order to a republic, which is what they were asking for, and this was also clear in the film. So Germany was still, Prussia rather, was still a monarchy, and the demand to democratize was very much a demand for an institutional change, which could also be, at that point, separated from the economic concerns around distribution of wealth and fighting exploitation and so on. But at that point, those two questions came together in the social democratic movement. So the economic question of how to overcome a capitalist economic order and the political question how to democratize an order that was still at that point marked by the Ancien regime, so it was very much authoritarian. The German Social Democrats begin to emerge from the shadows of illegality and from the fear of censorship only when Bismarck relaxes the socialist laws. Up to that point, they were all underground and they were operating under severe constraint. And so when Bernstein makes this intervention in the social democratic movement saying, actually, capitalism has shown a surprising capacity to adapt, and therefore perhaps we need to rethink the method because we are dialectical, we are Marxist, one thing that we should take away from the Marxist. And he presents this intervention as a Marxist intervention. One thing that we should take away is the flexibility of the method to adapt to when real circumstances change. When Bernstein makes that initial intervention, he's not the mainstream. He doesn't control the social democratic movement. It's true that Luxemburg, in this first encounter with Bernstein, highlights the theoretical gaps in the argument and draws out some of the themes that will then characterize her entire reflection. She's very young. She's one of 20-something young woman from Poland who makes a mark in the German social democratic movement because she stands up to Bernstein, who was, as I say, not in the majority politically, but very influential. He had been the literary executor of Engels, had been close to the founding fathers of the First International. And so that is interesting because that theoretical position is then revealed to become also the political position only with the war and at the point in which the German Social Democrats, as we saw with First World War, vote for the war credits and decide that they can't, as they say, leave patriotism to the right and take a different line politically. But what's really interesting in both of these scenes, the one where she's refusing to dance with Bernstein but is very friendly with all the other members of the Social Democratic Party, and then later when we see that the Social Democrats eventually politically really take on the Bernstein line, and at that point what was only a theoretical disagreement in 1900 becomes also a political disagreement with extreme consequences before the First World War and what leads to World War I.
So some of these arguments feel pretty remote, and this is history. But that line that you just used there, so when I watched it, there's one bit where you suddenly feel like you're in 2025. And it is that line. You can imagine Keir Starmer saying what was said in August 1914. I mean, it's reported to her by Liebknecht, but this is the debate that he's been involved in the Reichstag, in which the entire party, including Kautsky, all of them, I think Babel is dead by this point, but all of them, all of the ones who've lectured her about courage, when they are given the choice, do you back the Kaiser and the war and nationalism, or do you stand for the things you always said you believed in? They say, we cannot leave patriotism, the patriotism of the working classes, to the right. And even if you can't imagine Keir Starmer saying it, you can imagine Morgan McSweeney saying it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it really has to do with the changing circumstances for social democracy at that point, which are actually the circumstances that social democracy faces still today. And I think it's really important to remember this. So social democracy is at this juncture where it's made the transition from being a small party of intellectual elites to a mass party that is now can run for elections, begin to get votes from working class people, and who thinks that the considerations that it needs to take into account aren't just the theoretical considerations that this small elite had in its theoretical critique of capitalism for many, many years. Suddenly it becomes a political question of taking power, winning elections, understanding what the people want. And all of these were important then and are important now, I think in part because social democracy became at that point this movement that wasn't just about changing the world, but also trying to appeal to whatever citizens want, and therefore also trying to guess what citizens want. And this is I think, where this real disagreement is then in this relationship between parties, movements, and different historical conditions under which parties and movements operate, and the question of reform and revolution, which is, I think, what looms large in this whole debate.
And in a way, there is in the background of this an argument, as you say, about what the people want. And we see glimpses of it where Rosa Luxemburg is the one who believes that these intellectuals are trying to tell the workers when to have a general strike, when the time is right for revolution. And Rosa Luxemburg believed that the intellectuals should listen to the workers. The workers are going to be much more attuned to the conditions of revolution. But at the same time, another argument which was going on, which related to elections, and one of the things that the party discovered over these years, from 1890, when it became legal to stand in elections and fight them openly, was that when they campaigned and they said they didn't like the Kaiser, their vote went down. And when they simply ignored that or even hinted that they were okay with working class patriotism, the vote went up. And in a way, that argument, what it means to listen to the workers, lies behind the argument in 1914, which is the pivot of the whole film.
Yes, and actually also her response to all this, which comes across very clearly in the film, which is we have to have patience. The time of revolution is long. And in a way, what this is hinting at is, I think, also her approach to revolution, which we tend to think as an approach that is just about the method of change. And so, you know, is it bloody or is it peaceful? Does it happen all at once or does it happen slowly and gradually? And she has this, I think this was hinted a little bit in the film, but in her writings, she says explicitly, look, revolution is not about do you do it this way or do you do it that way, because actually behind every period of legal reform, there is a revolution, and a revolution is also realized through a series of legal reforms. And she has this really wonderful sentence where she says, you don't sit on the counter of history and decide whether to have reform or revolution in the way in which you decide to have hot or cold sausages, because the reasoning behind it is much more complicated, and it's really about understanding historical circumstances and understanding agents that operate in these historical circumstances. And that is also the difficulty. You can see she's not rushed at the end when she has this disagreement with Liebknecht on whether to support the Berlin Revolution, or when she says, you know, there's all these other cities, there's the whole of Germany that we need to take into account. There she comes across as someone who is much more prudent and does not want pointless bloodshed. On the other hand, when she's reasoning with the German Social Democrats, she's concerned that there is momentum there and that they are misreading the momentum and they're being too restrained when they could operate more carefully and do this kind of work that she wants to do, which is education, agitation. And that, I think that's really her, throughout the film and indeed throughout her work, her leading message was education. You need to educate, you need to constantly work with the masses. And education wasn't something that went from the top to the bottom, was also something that came from the bottom to the top. So this was the other really important part of her engagement with political activism and political work. It wasn't top-down. It was supposed to be a mutual process where the leaders or the intellectuals or the elite learn from the people, and the people themselves are crystallized in their views by work of theory.
Is that why we have, I think there are a couple of scenes in this film that possibly slightly too cheesy for me, and both of them are her as a child. One where she's looking at the flower waiting for it to bloom, but the other when she is teaching the servant in her household to read. Is that what we're meant to take? What do you think we're meant to take from these scenes?
I suppose the message is that she was a very sophisticated thinker and not someone that you could actually reduce to one thing or the other. So we have this image that she was against social democracy. But don't forget, she also had a really big argument with Lenin, with the Bolsheviks. And this is an important part of her work. And there it was the opposite. It was this critique of the bureaucratization of the Bolshevik movement, which was in part explained by the fact that it operated under very different circumstances from German social democracy. Again, it was Tsarist Russia. So you had censorship, you had underground work, you had secret police everywhere. And so the Bolsheviks got around. And this comes across, I think, in her relationship with Leo throughout the film, where he's doing always agitation. And it's a kind of work that is very, very different from the mass work that German social democracy does, because the circumstances are very different. And in the case of the Bolshevik movement, it's a type of movement that emerges from the vanguard theory that, you have, as Lenin says, you have to have the people who are the best trained, the more skilled, the best prepared, the most courageous, that lead the masses and then show the way to revolution. And she was against that as well, because she thought that went too far in terms of trying to tweak the people's will and to tweak the movement in the direction that just conformed to whatever the leaders thought was the right thing to do. And I think what we're meant to take from this film, actually, is this constant being placed in the middle of Luxemburg between, on the one hand, the top-down Bolshevik approach that went the way of revolution, but on the other hand, also the equally top-down approach of the German Social Democrats that was, we might call it today, technocracy. So this idea that they know they're professional politicians, they know what they're doing, and they decide the line and they make compromises because they understand much better that compromises are needed.
Do you think it's odd in this film, as you say, we go back at the beginning to the first Russian Revolution, the dress rehearsal, but there's nothing in it about Lenin. There's nothing in this film actually about the Russian Revolution, unless I missed it. It's a very, very German-centered film. And I want to ask you a bit about her Polishness and that relationship to Germany. I mean, I don't think the film suffers for it because it's got a clean line through it. And it might have complicated it to have her in 1917 and 1918 writing these ferocious, in their way, attacks on Lenin and Leninism. But no mention at all of the revolution that happened while she was in jail.
Yeah, that, I think you're right. It's a notable absence in the film. All of what there is to say in her work about Russia, about Russian politics, about Russian society, is filtered through Poland, including through the character of Leo, when he says, when at some point she's having this debate and she says, this is the German mass social democratic movement, it's not our puppet theater in Poland. And because the Polish social democratic movement was operating in Tsarist circumstances and Tsarist political institutions. And this work of agitation and propaganda, and this Leo, I think, is in the film a kind of Leninist character. He's someone who is very completely committed to politics, completely committed to political life, who is insisting on the comrades and agitation and does this. He speaks like the vanguard political leader would have spoken in this kind of Bolshevik circumstances. And I think because she's in between those two movements, the Polish one, which is influenced and inspired and operating under similar circumstances to the Bolsheviks on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the German social democracy. What we get, it's true that the film is obviously very German and the context is very German. What we get about Russia, I think, comes through this engagement with Poland. And finally, the word Zurich is constantly dropped. That is where all of them were, where they all gathered. Lenin was in Zurich. Luxemburg she did her PhD in Zurich. Many of the leaders of the Bolshevik movement had spent time there. That's where their political education happened. And so this is, I think, it's hinted at, but you're right. I also think that it is a big absence that, Lenin is never mentioned, while we see all the different characters of German social democracy in great detail, all of them.
One of the things that came across to me, so there are so many pivotal scenes in this film, but one of them is that gathering, I think it's July 1914, where it's an international gathering of socialists, and in various languages it says the war against war. And Kautsky is there, and Jaurès from France is there. And she's given this speech earlier, we've heard, where she more or less says, the French workers are not going to allow this, so why are the German workers going to allow it? She was wrong. All the workers were going to allow this war. But she sits behind the little label and it says Poland on it. And she is an outsider in that. She can't bring herself to speak. She senses the atmosphere in the room. She doesn't believe it. We get this passionate French speech. The workers are not going to allow this war. Well, they are. And she feels it. And I get from that we're meant to think that one of the reasons that she sees through it is that she isn't, being a Pole, she is an outsider to all of this, to the French, the German, the places where the revolution is meant to be going to happen. She sees through what they can't see through because she can smell their nationalism, essentially. And that when it comes to the test, she knows, it doesn't matter what she says at that meeting, she knows these people are already lost because the fatherland means something to them and it doesn't mean the same thing to her.
Yeah, and I think this is actually very important to understand a lot of her work, this quality of being an outsider. It's not just about nationalism. I mean, we can see she's a woman who is amongst men, but actually never really works on female questions. You can see also in the film when they say, we told you, Bebel and Kautsky and so on, tell her, Rosa, we told you to work on women's suffrage. And throughout her life, she was put under pressure because she wasn't really, it's not that she resented or that she fought feminism. You can see she's very closely connected to Clara Zetkin, and she's a feminist at heart, but she doesn't really embrace feminist causes, doesn't write from an explicitly feminist perspective. So she's a woman who, even in that identity axis, she's going for the men's topics. She doesn't do the kinds of things that people would associate a woman. So in that sense, she's also an outsider. She's an outsider in Poland. She comes from a Jewish family. So this is, again, a context that is very different, where she experiences the transitions from the empire in a very different way. She's also, and there's a very small hint of that when her mother, when she was very young, in the bed scene, then she says, how are you feeling today? Where she has this infection that leaves her with a limp throughout her life, where she can't walk. And this also you can see in the film that she's limping slightly. And again, it's not someone who is fully, you imagine a revolutionary, it was sort of fit and tough, and she's an outsider there as well, with amongst able-bodied people. She's someone who has a slight disability. And this, I think, accounts for, in a way, the originality also of her work, that she doesn't fit into any of these categories and therefore can think with much more flexibility around each of these axes of identity that we might project on her.
The film suggests to me that she saw the war coming. There are different ways to interpret what happened in 1914. For many people, unquestionably at the time, it was a shock. And she talks in one of her speeches, we've had 40 years of peace, that's an illusion. You can't call this peace because of the horrors that go along with the peace, including the wars that are being taking place outside of Europe. But there's a feeling in this film from quite early on, not just in 1914 and 1913, she senses that the real question that is going to come, the one that is going to be put to the party and to the workers, is what do you do when your ruling classes fight each other? Is that accurate? Do you think, is it fair to say of Luxemburg that she saw it coming in the ways that the others didn't?
Yes, absolutely. And I think this is the reason for this is something that was, again, not very well explained actually in the films, only very hinted, very little. And it has to do with her thought and with her economic thought. There's only a sentence where she says, I can't remember now exactly how it goes, but something about there hasn't been war in Europe, but there have been wars outside Europe. And a lot of her contribution in political economy is around the question of imperialism. And a lot of her engagement with Bernstein and her disagreement with Bernstein was on the seemingly abstract theoretical question of does capitalism have a capacity to adapt and develop, and does technological change mean that there's more middle classes, people are better off, that exploitation is not as bad as it was. The standard classical Marxist theory was that capitalism would collapse at some point. And the reason for Bernstein's move towards reformism is to say, well, look at the facts on the ground. We have more technological development, we have more economic development, and the middle classes are rising. We have cooperatives, we have the credit and debit system, we have the development of banks and so on. And there, already theoretically, she takes the position that all of these seemingly factors that make capitalism adapt are actually outsourced to other parts of the world. So you have a core that is developing and is producing well-being when it goes well, but then there are moments where, all the time it's being outsourced to the periphery of the world, and then there are moments of crisis where this also doesn't hold, and therefore you get these imperialistic rivalries that initially take place outside the borders of Europe and then become rivalries between European states. And so all the geopolitical differences between different centers of power in Europe emerge. So she saw the war coming because she thought that war was a consequence of capitalist development and of this capitalist mode of production taking over more and more alternative modes of production in different parts of the world, of the standard economic analysis around, why there is crisis, because there is heightened exploitation, because then there is underconsumption. People are too poor to then buy the kinds of things that capital wants to sell them. And so I think all of this is in a way indicated, but in her work there was a sort of theoretical prediction for why there would be war and why war is fundamentally connected not to geopolitical rivalry or to cultural differences or to inherent identity-related reasons. It's a consequence of competition, of globalization, of capitalism. And that's why she gets really angry, because she says capital is winning. Capital is producing weapons, it's selling the weapons, and the workers whose primary identity is that of belonging to the working class, now are fighting each other as if they just belong to these different nations that in peacetime are constantly exploiting them.
Is it fair to say that on that, the other person who saw it just as she did was Lenin? I mean, they both saw it in those terms. But the difference between them, so there's no Lenin in this film, but it's there deep in the background. The difference between them is that she genuinely wanted to stop this war. She was a stop the war politician, not just before it happened, but after it happened. She and Liebknecht, they thought their mission was to stop this senseless slaughter and get back to the politics of genuine workers' engagement with their own fate. Lenin was perfectly happy to let the war play itself out because, you can disagree with me here, because that was the opportunity for this thing called the revolution. And there is a moment in the film where I can't remember who it is, but someone says to her the phrase, something, something, the revolution. And she says, stop talking about the revolution. There is no single revolution.
Yeah, my reading of Lenin is slightly different. I think Lenin was also a pacifist. He also thought that war was a consequence of capital, that if you remove capitalist contradictions from the world, then you don't get war. So I think the difference wasn't there. But I think there was an important difference between them, and I think it was on the national question. And so she was not a nation-state defender, Luxemburg. So the difference there was Lenin's line was, okay, nations, we support them when nationalism goes alongside with socialist emancipation. We support the right of peoples to self-determination, and this shows up then in the project. You know, the setup of the Soviet Union is actually built on that principle. She already, in the Polish social democratic movement, was in contradictions and in conflict with her social democratic fellows, because this was Poland under the Russian Empire, and she was not necessarily in favor of Polish independence. So there is this whole very controversial question of what was her position on Polish nationalism. Although I personally think from just reading her work, she was not someone who resented national cultures. It's that wonderful poetry. She loved nationalist poets and she loved literature. And so there was a sense in which one can appreciate nations from a cultural perspective. But the nation-state principle, which became the organizing principle of the world after World War I and was something that Lenin was very strongly in favor of, she resented that because she thought that that breaks up international solidarity. And I think her entire work is this effort to resist nationalism, both in its social democratic version, when it takes the form of compromise and reform and democratize the nation state, but go no further, just do what you can to tame capitalism within your borders, which is the project of social democracy in the second half also of the 20th century, but also, I think, equally resenting nationalism in its state socialist form, which was inspired by the Leninist principle of self-determination.
For me, one of the most haunting moments in the film, and I looked at my watch when it's exactly halfway through. So in that early scene, the fancy dress New Year's Eve party, here are all these people who are going to let her down. In their different ways, they're going to let her down. And in August 1914, they all let her down, including Louise Kautsky, who they have boys at the front. She's the one who...
And they're all wearing masks. It's also beautiful visually in the film how this is
masks,
conveyed.
And Bernstein is wearing an idiot hat. But the haunting moment is the first scene that Liebknecht appears, because here finally is someone who is totally on the same side as her. And I want to scream at the screen, but he's the one who's going to kill you. Like, he actually is your nemesis, because in that moment where Babel mansplains courage to her and says it's about knowing when to use it, and as you said, there are 2 points, one of which where she thinks they let themselves down because they didn't have the courage to resist the war. But Liebknecht is the one who's going to misjudge the moment at the end of the war and think, this is our revolutionary moment, and it just calls for courage. He more or less, when they have that argument, says to her, why aren't you with me? Yeah. And she says, rightly, because you have misunderstood. This is not just about you boys with your overcoats and your rifles. And when she screams at them as they're being shot at, even if you take Berlin, what the hell do you think you're going to do? And it's what's haunting and harrowing about this film is that her nemesis, who appears halfway through, is the person who is most closely aligned to her, except on that question, where he is just as bad as all the other men.
Yes, and I think it's because he's dogmatic. And I think her entire stance is a non-dogmatic stance. You can see it in the way she writes her speeches, for example. You know, these men read their speeches, both Jogisches and Liebknecht. They read their speeches, and the way they acted is, I think, very, very nicely done in the film. They're just reading a script and they're writing a script. What they write is exactly what you'd expect someone with that position to write. And she starts in this very final article. It really struck me, the one that first Liebknecht reads his piece, and it's very formulaic. It's kind of boring. It's read with a certain tone of, you know, the bureaucrat, the future bureaucrat. He never got to become a bureaucrat, but he would have been like all these other men who became bureaucrats. And she starts her speech by saying, order reigns in Berlin, your order is built on sand, and starts with poetry almost. And I think her entire work is a sort of way of speaking past these two traditions that have become the dominant traditions of the 20th century, for better or worse. You know, one is the Western model of democracy and capitalism and fighting capitalism, taming capitalism. The other one is going completely the other way, you know, central planning, vanguard parties that then become the nomenclatura and the elite that is completely detached from the people and doesn't really understand when they don't want them anymore, and so collapses with the Cold War. And for me, I've always been really interested in her work, in part because she has this very strong commitment to freedom, and it's a very humanist commitment as well. You can see, in fact, it's not just humanist, it's also flowers and plants and animals. It's the entire harmony of the universe, and this question of what are the threats to living together in peace. What she wants to do is she wants to live a world in peace, and on the other hand, as I say, these failures of also her own tragedy, her personal tragedy, which for me raises this really interesting question of, she's a counterfactual, but also a counterfactual that keeps making you think, well, what would her world have looked like? Because we've never known it. We've only known this world of these men, you know, either the social democratic version or the Soviet Bolshevik nomenclatura version. And it's sort of interesting to ask yourself the question of, what does that position really lead to? This position that you have to educate the masses, but you can't dominate them. You have to take your cues from the movement, but you can't completely go with whatever they're telling you, because that's, again, the social democratic position, which says, well, the workers want patriotism. And she's saying, well, hang on a minute, do they really? And it's a very interesting question. You know, what does this actually lead to politically? But it's very interesting also as a criticism for whatever circumstance we find ourselves, to just keep engaging with these positions.
So I want to ask you in a second where you think it leads to politically now, but I just want to ask you about a couple more scenes in this and her relationship with Leo. You say he's the Leninist, but he's also deeply human in the way he's portrayed in this, I think. There's something very touching about him. He's a slightly comic figure, but there are those two arguments that they have early on, one playful, one where they throw crockery at each other. The first one, where she's saying in a playful way, why can't we have basically a bourgeois life? Why can't we be revolutionaries with a bourgeois life? Why can't we have picnics and opera? I can't remember the list, but it's, you know, why can't we have a nursery and all of that? The much more hard-edged argument is basically when she says, why can't we have children? And he says, the revolution is your child. The ideas, I think he says, are your children. How do you read those two scenes?
I read them as a position that says a bourgeois life is not just for the bourgeoisie. And so I think it's, again, her resistance of this idea that there are conventions of how we ought to live. And insofar as, you know, bourgeois life boils down to loving your family and having children and reading books and having a garden and enjoying yourself, her problem with that is that not everyone in the world can have it. And so that it's not that the convention as such is a problem, or that the life as such is a problem, is that the life is not given to everyone, and so is not shared with humanity. And in that kind of world, you can't even be yourself. And so I think, and you see it in the way she engages with soldiers, with maids, with all the people who are in socially hierarchical ranking lower to her. She's constantly asking herself the question of, well, this life is denied to them. A life of reading is denied to her maid when she's a young child. And so there's nothing wrong with bourgeois life itself, except that it's only for the bourgeoisie, and it would be nicer if it was for everyone. And I think that's her position.
Unless I misread you, you were looking at me skeptically when I said I thought that Leo was sympathetically played in this. One of the things I find touching about him, so yeah, he's also slightly robotic, and he's a kind of robotic revolutionary, and he betrays her, we see in that scene, and she rejects him. And then he's kind of hanging around like a bad smell or like a loyal dog. But there is something touching about his loyalty, and I think it's partly informed by knowing what happened to him which is he died 2 months after she and Liebknecht did. And as I understand it, he was murdered because he was determined to investigate their murders. So even after her death, he gave his life to try and find out what had happened to her. Am I wrong to be moved by that?
Yeah, no, I think he's very human. He's very human. Obviously, you see the flaws of his character and his politics from her perspective, and we are led to see those flaws, but then we also see his humanity. But then you also see, the thing in this film is you see the humanity of everyone, including, I just noticed this time for the first time, because I've seen this film, I show it to my students every year, so I've seen it 15 years or something every year. And so now I just noticed the details. In the very final scene, the person who shoots her gives her the coat. And, just before she's shot, this police person who is offering her to just hold her coat, and she's wearing this coat, and she's kind of behaving in a humane way, and then he's just about to shoot her. And I think the film is always showing, and I think rightly, this ambiguity of being human and being a human in a particular social position, which forces certain demands on you, but ultimately her belief that if the system wasn't in this way, then humanity would actually flourish and would thrive and would emerge, and we would see it much more clearly from everyone.
You did suggest there's a counterfactual here. There's a sort of what if she had lived, or what if her ideas had lived? The two things that she was opposed to came to be the two dominant modes of politics in the 20th century, the Leninist model, let's call it, and the social democratic reformist model, Bernstein or Lenin, and not her. Regardless of whether or not it would have been different had she lived, is there really a place, do you think, for Rosa Luxemburg's politics now? And if there is, where is it? In a world in which, as I said, you can hear politicians saying not quite the Leninist things, I don't think, but some of the other things that she was arguing against. You can hear them saying it loud and clear, including our job is not to allow the patriotism of the workers to be colonized by the far right. Where's the Rosa Luxemburg position in British politics, say in 2025? Short answer.
Well, okay, so three things. So the first one, but I will say them I'll try and say them very, very shortly. And maybe they're not just about British politics, maybe they're about, politics more general. So the first one is her insight that you can't reduce geopolitical conflict to cultural conflict and to identity-based conflict. So it's not about, there's a dynamic of capitalist development and globalization that calls for a different analysis of the world. And that if you don't have those categories, then you're missing something really important. And I think she's right on that. The second one is politics. So she's someone who writes a lot about the political party and, indeed the party unions, mass strikes, also on these kind of questions of tactical organization. But it comes across very strongly in her work, and I think, again, she's right, that the party cannot be reduced to an electoral machine, that there is a role that a political party plays that goes beyond just taking opinions for granted, and taking the common sense, taking, polls and focus groups and whatever the people are telling you at any given point, and running and organizing all your politics based on what you find. You have a larger educational role to play, and there is sort of a wider way of thinking about a political party that isn't just representative democracy at the day in which you vote for elections. It's all reduced to election day campaigns, leaders, organization around elections, that we need to think the role of parties in society. I think she's right about that. And the third one, I think, and this is maybe more complicated and more kind of philosophical, but I think it's really her humanism, that in the end, her socialism is an instance of her being a humanist. And this position is, this way of looking at the world fundamentally is about thinking of humans as beings of a certain kind, with certain vulnerabilities, with this yearning for freedom that we all have, with this intolerance of suffering and injustice of other people, and that you need that in politics and in understanding the world and in being moved to act to change it.
And that, to me, is why, and this is conveyed very powerfully in the film, that's why for her the First World War wasn't merely an intellectual affront or a betrayal of the things that she believed in. It was literally intolerable. And you see it, it's destroying her before she dies. Yeah. You can see it eating away at her, and it more or less broken her already. Yeah. 4 years of that kind of horror can't be lived with.
Yeah.
The film explored her relationship with nature a lot and the natural world. And there was one line that stood out to me, I can't remember exactly, but she was saying she almost didn't feel human. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how that connected with her political philosophy or her humanism as well.
And just to add to that, the thing that we haven't mentioned is that an absolutely central relationship is with Mimi, and Mimi is a cat.
And also she was a botanist. This comes across in the film where she makes these pressed leaves, and she really has, there's now also been published, studies on her knowledge of plants and her concern for plants. And so I think it all comes down to this idea that somehow the universe is connected, and that the plight of, and you see it also in the scene with the buffalo where she sees the tears of and says it's a fellow brother. And so this idea that it's actually the way to understand humans' place in the world. And it's quite interesting for when you think about environmental concerns, that concerns for nature and concerns for humanity aren't necessarily separate from each other, that to care for nature is to care for humans, and to care for humans is to look after nature and to think about future generations and how they can relate to it. And I think it's also very insightful. It's interesting that it's in the film, it's a very important part of her life, not cast in these environmental terms, so not cast in ecologist terms and so on, but it's a very important part of her life that there is this understanding of the universe as a place where everything is connected, and that what's fundamentally wrong and unjust about capitalism is that it destroys all of this. It destroys nature, it destroys humanity.
Just quickly, because I was thinking it when I saw that scene where she sees the buffalo being beaten, do you think that's meant to be referencing the celebrated event just before Nietzsche went mad, when he saw a horse being beaten in Turin, and that was the thing that finally tipped him over? And these two seem to have some kind of echo going on?
Yeah, I thought about that. I mean, I don't know what the evidence is for any kind of explicit link between those, but it's definitely evocative of that same scene. And this, again, this idea that you see when humans mistreat animals, it's a reflection on the loss of humanity, not just because of the animal, but just because of humanity.
I have a question about the conception of the masses, because you said one of the things we could take from her thought today is this rethinking of the role of political parties and so on. But what about her conception of the masses, which was as well very central? Should we really abandon the concept as it happened in a revolutionary way, as it did during the 20th century, or is there any possibility and desirability to recover that concept?
Yeah, I think this is a really important concept to her, and it's because of this pedagogical way in which she understands political movements, I think. So this idea that masses aren't just the puppets of the leaders, that that they play off against each other or that they manipulate, they decide. She thinks that the masses, especially when they're engaged in political movement, develop a kind of insight and a kind of learning from history, from circumstances, from being in a certain position. And in doing so, can then themselves have things to say to the leaders. And so this distinction that is a very elitist distinction between people who know, and this is again going back to the vanguard question, the people who have learned, who have studied, who know about revolutionary movements, who know about history, who knows about transition. Luxemburg thinks that there is a wisdom of the masses in political movements, especially as they are engaged in real politics, that gives them an insight that you cannot ignore and that you cannot also just infer from reading, for example, or from knowing. So her whole stance on, this is why I said this kind of pedagogical stance, was that in the life of politics you develop certain skills and those learning tools that the masses have are crucial for when the masses then become, when the revolution wins or when you change, when there is a fundamental change. And it's also really important when you think about the Soviet Revolution, for example, the Bolshevik Revolution and the Soviet Union, where this rift between the vanguard and the masses, which was already there in opposition when they were fighting against the Tsarist regime, then becomes the rift between the nomenclatura and the citizens. So it's sort of inherited. It's almost like an original sin. And she says this, and she has this intuition. It's well before, Brezhnev and well before Stalin. Of course, she died before any of this. But she had theoretically understood that if you don't think about the relationship between the leaders of a movement and democracy in the political movement as it develops, and if you don't think about political education very, very carefully, then you run the risk of then also losing the movement, and it becomes this, well, what we know for the 20th century, basically what Bolshevik socialism ended up becoming, becomes really rigidified and not really aware of what's going on, and you lose this capacity.
And I believe she said very early in 1918 to the people who said of the Russian Revolution, it will be democratic, but we've got to do the revolution first. She said, if it isn't democratic from day one, it'll never be
exactly.
democratic.
And she has this famous sentence, freedom is always the freedom of the other to think differently. And this was because she was really resisting against these pressures of censorship and this idea that now it's an emergency and so we can betray the principles because it's an emergency, but we will go back to being real democrats after. And she insisted that this was actually how you lost democracy from day one and we could never really go back to it.
And you could say, as you say that, I'm thinking those two key moments in 1914 and 1918, the thing in both cases that she is against is emergency politics.
Yeah. And actually, you see this when you look at it from the social democratic perspective, also technocracy. This idea that we have also normalized, that there are some people up there that just by virtue of the role that they play, because they're leaders, because they know stuff better, because they're more, if I talk to politicians, sometimes they tell me, if you only knew all what I see and what I know, and they give you the sense that there are some people out there that know better. And her entire, I think, going back to the movement, her entire vindication of the wisdom of the movement is exactly to resist that and say, well, even if that is the case, it's a problem.
Which politicians say that to you?
Well, I'm not going to name names. I never name names.
So she's obviously was quite idealistic and very passionate and obviously really understood how to use media and very engaged in sort of local publications. How do you think her sort of brand of politics and her opinions would translate if she was in the social media world of today and how that can hyperpolarize politics?
I don't know, because I think actually the circumstances in which some of these guys were operating were much harder than what we have today. I mean, they had secret police, you couldn't have a speech like this, you couldn't have a meeting like this because you'd have spies everywhere and you just couldn't hold on to certain views because you literally risked going to prison. You had a working class movement that was for the most part illiterate, so you were talking to people that... So I think we can overplay the fact that we now have a media environment and a knowledge environment where it's, it's very difficult, because I actually think it was much harder for them. I mean, you didn't have mass universities, you didn't have publicly funded schools, and it was everything was for the elite. And so if you wanted to try and bring people with you, the work was much, much harder. And I think maybe it's because we've somehow lost that world and are not really used to it anymore. And we think these institutions should do the work themselves. And if they don't do the work, we think, well, we're in trouble. Whereas for these earlier revolutionaries, the institutions weren't there, they needed to be created. And so the responsibility of individuals to do their share with agitation, with education, with speaking in a certain way was much higher. And I think it's, in some ways for me, it's a call to also personal responsibility in terms of, well, what am I doing for the media environment? What am I sort of saying to my students? How am I interpreting circumstances? And I think it's the fact that circumstances are different, I don't think mean that ours are much harder, but maybe I'm an optimist, I don't know.
But do you think, so her argument, which was the only way to find out what the workers really think is to find out what happens when the workers are given real political choices, to find out in a way what the movement does when it's not being led from the top, was a function of the fact that this was an age of illiteracy, an absence of education, the institutions weren't there. So in making that argument, she was effectively saying, the only way we can know what people think is to get among them. Now, someone might say to her, no, you can know what they think. This is a literate population, this is an educated population, they all have the opportunity to express themselves. Would she still think you have to get among them and do street politics to find out what they think?
So I'm gonna go back to something. I don't know if she says the word dialectic or whether I've just kind of summoned it from my reading of her. But I would go back to this dialectic because I don't think she's saying we just need to listen to what people want and deliver what they want and what they tell us they want. She's really insistent on theory giving you a certain reading of the world. And theory there was Marxist theory, was socialist theory, was this idea that we are in a capitalist mode of production. The capitalist mode of production has certain tensions and certain conflicts, that it generates crises of a certain kind, that we need to be able to read those crises when they emerge in the right way. And so it wasn't the workers without theory. It wasn't just, take the workers. And also not the idea that to have working class consciousness or working class awareness, it's enough to be a worker. They were very clear of the fact that a lot of the workers would, as they do, turn patriot or turn nationalist or later on turn Nazi. So people aren't just taking preferences for given without making an effort to understand and to engage with those preferences and to offer some sense of orientation. But it's a process that goes both ways. It's not that you just have the intellectual elite and the vanguard that gives you the theory and then the masses go and operate and realize the theory. But it's also not what many people think now, which is, well, we then therefore just see what people want and do what they want. And, if people don't have tools and if there isn't an intellectual discourse and a cultural debate, then what the workers will give you or what the public will give you or what citizens will give you will be very impoverished. And this then goes back to the media question, which is ultimately what our predicament is now.
Yeah, and in a way, I wasn't saying that she thinks you find out what they believe and then you do it, but you cannot know what they believe unless you're willing to get among them. And like you, I think in the current media environment, she would say one of the illusions is that you can find out what people think by going online, because that's not getting among them. That's just another impoverished or warped version of a political identity.
Yeah, and also that people in a crisis, when they act together, that there's something to joint action and to solidarity and to all these features that only emerge when people are coming together to resolve problems. And I think, again, what we're missing now is, yes, people are coming together in social media and so on, but they're not really resolving problems. They're just saying something and then amplifying what everyone is saying, and then it becomes times N. But you don't really see judgments really being operating in context, and you don't really see an engagement with the problem of the kind that would be needed to resolve the problem.
For me, there was a second moment when I was suddenly not in the early 1900s or 1986 when the film was made, but in 2025. And it was when, and I don't know if it's the translation from the German or not, but it's when it's two references to the word genocide. I think she's talking about the war. And that resonates in 2025. And so I think that leads to the great question, which we've already touched on, which is maybe for both of you, if you were really, really pressed here in 2025, whose picture of society, capitalism, the 20th century, 21st century is right? Bernstein's, there's conflicts and so on, but there's more and more adaptability and conflicts even out and, steady as she goes. Or Luxemburg's, the eras of peace are temporary, partial, limited and fade. And are we in a Luxemburg moment? If she was sitting, the shade of Luxemburg was sitting with us tonight, is 2025 a world, for all its differences, that she would recognise? Or would she say, I was wrong about all sorts of things?
Great question.
One thing that I actually wanted to also pick up, this references to genocide. In her work, of course it resonates in our world, but in her work, it's basically a vocation of German colonialism. And so this idea that, and she mentions this at some point, it comes with her analysis of there hasn't been war in Europe, but there has been outside. And what she's really thinking about there is a Herero genocide and colonialism in Namibia. So this entire German history, which, and I think von Trotta, the producer, wanted to bring that out also because the Germans think of genocide only as World War II now. And there's been this there is oblivion when it comes to the previous German colonialism and previous, extermination of people outside Europe. So I think it's really important that it's there because it sort of brings out the nuances and the contribution of her thought. I personally think that her reading of the world is very much resonant and is very important for the present. And that's why I study her and I read her and I find inspiration. I don't think that, of course things change, technology changes, empirical circumstances changes. We have to reckon with the success of social democracy, and that also changes the ways in which politics operate. These questions of reform and revolution and method are different for us. They're not exactly the same because we haven't been working with the secret police and with the Tsarist Russia. We also are living in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. So again, that world is not with us anymore. So there are fundamental differences, but I think when it comes to her insights on where do the crises of the contemporary world come from, what are the fundamental problems of politics, what needs to change, I personally really share her critique of capitalism.
And the only thing I would say on your question, would she say, well, maybe Bernstein was right? I'm sure she would say no for two reasons. One, the human relation with the natural world doesn't suggest that kind of evolutionary story is sustainable. And the second is simply that social democracy of that kind does look increasingly inadequate for the scale of the problems that we face. I'm aware this episode is coming out on Christmas Eve. This is our Christmas film season. So a reminder that there is a bonus episode available now on PPF Plus in which we discuss the ideas in a very well-known Christmas movie. I talk to the historian of film and quiz show superstar Harrison Whitaker about Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life and some of the surprising philosophical, religious and moral ideas contained within it. If you would like to get that bonus episode, all of our bonus episodes, ad-free listening, automatic sign-up to our fortnightly newsletter, Subscribe to PPF Plus now. Just click on the link in the show description, go to ppfideas.com. Next time, in our Film of Ideas series, it's another unconventional biopic of a deeply unconventional philosopher. I'm going to be talking to Nikhil Krishnan about Derek Jarman's Wittgenstein. Do join us for that. This has been Past, Present, Future.